What's going on, guys? Spazmattic here, back inside Destiny 2, and in this video I'm going to give you guys a review of the Broadsword launcher, which is this week's New Monarchy's weapon for winning the faction rally. So obviously New Monarchy won this week's faction rally, and you get this weapon for pledging to New Monarchy. If you pledge to New Monarchy, they won, so you only have to pay 1,000 Glimmer for this thing. But if you did not pledge to New Monarchy, Dead Orbit, or Future War Cult, you have to pay 50,000 Glimmer for this rocket launcher. So I'm going to do a review on this thing and kind of compare it to the Curtain Call and the Sins of the Past, just because those two rocket launchers are probably by far the most used and probably the best rocket launchers in the game for basically anything inside of Destiny, just because they have cluster bombs. Even though the Broadsword launcher does not have cluster bombs, I'll still be comparing it in terms of the stats and everything, and see how well it compares to the other two rocket launchers. So going over the perks on the Broadsword launcher, it has adaptive frame, a well-rounded grip, reliable and sturdy. During the first row, it's got countermass. This weapon is weighted for vertical recoil, greatly controls recoil, increases stability, increases handling speed, volatile launch, yada yada, and then smart drift control. You guys can read these stats there, but I like to run the smart drift control just because it gives probably the best stat bonus, because when you have countermass on, obviously smart drift control gives you a boost to velocity, while volatile launch is kind of good for blast radius, but it takes away velocity and stability and handling. So I guess I wouldn't say that's a good takeaway. I wouldn't really just add blast radius while taking down the other three stats there. So I like to run smart drift control, and I like to take velocity over blast radius, which is another reason why I would take smart drift control over volatile launch. But it's up to you guys. For the middle tree, you got implosion rounds and of course high velocity rounds. I like to run high velocity rounds just because when you have high velocity rounds, you get increased blast radius and a reload speed, and when you have a rocket launcher, you don't really need stability. For a rocket launcher, it's kind of pointless to have stability on a rocket launcher, kind of, I guess. You don't really need it as much as you need reload speed and velocity, of course, or blast radius. So for the last tree, obviously it has auto loading holster, which is the same perk the Sins of the Past has. So I would say this weapon, this rocket launcher, does compare it I'd say it's decent, but just because it doesn't have cluster bombs is a reason why this thing won't be used as much as you see a Curtain Call or a Sins of the Past. So comparing the three rocket launchers to each other, as you can tell up on the screen here, I have pictures from the Destiny item manager site. I did this for the Breaktech Osprey rocket launcher as well, so you guys can check that out for yourselves. You just inspect the weapon on the website and it gives you all the stats and everything for the weapon itself. But as you guys can see here, the Sins of the Past has a rounds per minute of 15, while the Broadsword launcher has a rounds per minute of 20 and Curtain Call 25. So that means you could basically shoot 20 rockets in a minute with the Broadsword launcher, which is 5 more rockets than the Sins of the Past. That is pretty good, because the Broadsword launcher does have an increase of 17 more reload speed than the Sins of the Past as well, because obviously reload speed is a big matter in DPS, because the faster you can reload the weapon, the more shots you can get off. But obviously, for the Sins of the Past, when you're using most rocket launchers during a boss fight or a raid, you're most likely going to be using the Lunafaction boots, a rally barricade, or you're a hunter and you just use the marksman dodge for that free reload speed. So obviously, the reload speed isn't a big factor on rocket launchers, but as you can tell here, the Broadsword launcher beats the Sins of the Past in terms of reload. Comparing the velocity and blast radius to the other rocket launchers with the Broadsword launcher, the other stats like handling, stability, aim assistance really isn't that big of a deal for a rocket launcher in Destiny 2, in my opinion, just because obviously velocity shows how fast the rocket travels itself, and the blast radius, which is obviously how big the radius of the blast is when the rocket hits something. So obviously for the blast radius for the Broadsword launcher, it has a blast radius of 75, which is 13 more than the Curtain Call, and of course 23 less than the Sins of the Past. So Sins of the Past almost has a max blast radius of 98, which is pretty insane, which means if you're clearing out ads during a raid or a strike, you can clear out more of those ads than the other two rocket launchers compared to each other. But obviously, most times when you're using a rocket, I mean, you could use a rocket during a strike, but most of the times you're not really using a rocket to clear ads. You're usually using like your better devils or your whatever your primary or secondary weapon is. But obviously you could use rockets for a huge horde, obviously, but I would just say that the Sins of the Past wins the blast radius category here by far, just because of how much blast radius the weapon has. Going over the velocity, the Broadsword launcher has a velocity of 71, so as you guys can see, it's a yellow wording on the picture here. I have the velocity masterwork for all three of the rocket launchers, because I think velocity is one of the better masterworks for rockets in this game. But with the velocity masterwork on all three of the rockets, the Broadsword launcher has a velocity of 71, while the Sins of the Past has a velocity of 59 and Curtain Call has a velocity of 80. Obviously, the Curtain Call has the best velocity out of the 3 rockets, so obviously Curtain Call will win that category with the most velocity. Which makes the Curtain Call so much better than the other 2 rockets is that it has 25 rounds per minute, meaning you can shoot 25 rockets in a minute during DPS phases and during boss fights and raids and stuff like that. So that makes it a really good weapon to use. Probably the best rocket launcher in the game for boss damage. But comparing the Broadsword launcher in terms of using it in general over the Sins of the Past with the Curtain Call, you definitely could use this thing as a pretty decent rocket launcher just because it has auto-loading holster, which is if you don't want to reload your rocket, you just switch to it. After you shoot a rocket, it'll reload itself when it's like put away on your character, which is pretty nice. But obviously the Broadsword launcher does not have cluster bombs, which is a pretty big deal with rockets nowadays, because the Braytech Osprey does have cluster bombs, which makes it a pretty decent and viable rocket launcher to use in the game, because cluster bombs do a decent amount of damage and they help clear out ads a lot easier just because of how big the radiuses are of them and how much damage they do. But I would say this is definitely one of the better rockets in the game in terms of not having cluster bombs, just because, I haven't really used many other rockets in this game that don't have cluster bombs, so I can't really say much about those rockets because I don't really use them, such as like Blue Shift and stuff like that. But I would definitely say this is one of the better ones just because it has auto-loading holster, and I'd say that's a pretty decent perk to have. Not as good as cluster bombs, but it's viable. You can use it. It's pretty decent, but like I said, obviously I would use Sins of the Past or Curtain Call over the Broadsword launcher, which is this week's weapon for New Monarchy for winning the faction rally. So, overall, like I said, I would use Curtain Call the most out of the 3, Sins of the Past second, and Broadsword launcher third, just because Broadsword launcher doesn't have cluster bombs, even though Broadsword launcher does have a higher reload speed. But like I said, reload speed isn't really that big of a factor when it comes to doing boss damage and DPS and stuff like that during those fights and strikes and raids. So this is my take on the Broadsword launcher, comparing it to probably the 2 most used rocket launchers in the game. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this review of the comparisons of this rocket to the other 2 inside of Destiny 2. If you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys later back inside Destiny 2. Peace.